Hello, and welcome to Education and Training.
This podcast is about democracy. Democracy is a system of government in which all the people of a state or polity are involved in making decisions about its affairs, typically by voting to elect representatives to a parliament or similar assembly. Democracy in Greek means demos, is people, and krasi means rule. Therefore, people rule. This form of government came about when the people considered either the oligarchy or dictator they lived under to be corrupt and not in the interest of the majority of the people, and therefore the people should hold the power. Let's look at the main characteristics that we associate with democracy. Free and fair multi-party elections. Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that elections must be periodic, genuine, organised according to universal suffrage, and by secret ballot. This guarantees the population the opportunity to change their leaders should they wish to. Free and fair means that elections offer equal opportunities for all competing parties, and access to the media is fair. There also must be more than one party to choose from. For democracy to work, everyone must agree to accept the results of the freely held elections. The people and parties who have lost power, or those who fail to gain it, must be willing to accept defeat. If the loser refuses to accept the winner, the election's legitimacy is diminished, and the political system may be marked by conflict and instability. A key test for democracy is the successful and peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. Accountability is the government's acknowledgement of their responsibility to the people of the state. Politicians in functioning democracies are under constant scrutiny from the public. Ineffective politicians are soon removed, either by holding them accountable for an abuse of office, or they're just simply not voted for. Equality, freedom, and human rights are moral principles or norms that describe certain standards of human behaviour and are regularly protected as legal rights in international law. They are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights, to which a person is inherently entitled simply because they are a human, and human rights apply to all human beings regardless of their nation, location, language, religion, ethnic origin, or any other status. They are applicable everywhere and at every time in a sense of them being universal, and they are egalitarian in a sense of being the same for everyone. There are 30 of these rights on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the main ones are considered to be the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, right to a fair trial, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and the freedom of movement. Another characteristic of democracy is whether it is direct or representative. What this means is that in direct democracy is that every single member of the society has a vote on every single issue. So could you imagine the UK Parliament having to pass every single bill over to the public to pass a vote on? Then direct democracy is impractical. So democracy has evolved over time to a representative democracy, where we elect certain people who we believe will make responsible decisions on our behalf. Therefore, they represent us within government. Where did this notion of democracy first come from? Cleisthenes, who was an ancient Greek, is credited with reforming the constitution of ancient Athens and setting it on a democratic footing in 508 BCE. For these accomplishments, historians refer to him as the father of Athenian democracy. Even from democracy's early beginnings, it was challenged by other modes of government. The Spartans and the Athenians had a war for 30 years over their rivalry for who would be the more dominant state within Greece. The Spartans are well known for being oligarchs, and they preferred their system of government, which is based on 2 kings and a council of 15 ephors, as they thought they had the most experienced and most intelligent people ruling and making decisions for the rest of the population. The Athenians, however, thought that democracy was a better system, and that every citizen, well, every male citizen for the Athenians, had a right to vote on the major decisions for the state. The Spartans won the conflict between Sparta and Athenia over the 30 years, and this had a significant impact on democracy being able to spread. Many philosophers at the time, such as Socrates, had opinions on whether democracy was a good form of government. So do you think that Socrates was for democracy or against? Well, he was against democracy. Socrates was of the opinion that as he was a philosopher and a smart politician, that he was much better placed to make decisions than your average man. Whereas what the notion of democracy proposes is that every person has the right to a vote. Socrates' argument was that I'm not your average man, I study politics, and therefore my vote should carry more weight than the simple farmer who doesn't understand politics. Socrates has a point, and he felt so strongly about his argument that he was willing to die for it, and he was forced to drink a cup of hemlock as his punishment for spreading the word amongst the youth of Athens at the time that democracy was not a good idea. And I'll make a point to illustrate what Socrates was arguing. Have you voted in recent elections? If you did vote, did you read fully the manifesto of the party you were voting for? Even if you did that, did you read the manifesto of all the parties that you didn't vote for? If you didn't do this, then how do you know what you were voting for? In Socrates' eyes, you're the farmer in the field who is uninformed and guessing who should be in charge. Whereas Socrates, being a clever philosopher and politician, would have made a much better informed decision. So the Spartans and states like Russia and China believe that the best system of government is not a democracy, but one where there are only a few people who know what they are doing in charge. Let's turn to some significant events that have taken place within democracy's evolution. The Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter, established for the first time the principle that everyone, including the king, was subject to law. In 1215, King John of England wielded absolute power. A group of barons were unhappy and made the king sign a charter which limited the king's power and gave powerful barons a say in legislation and taxation. The Magna Carta was far from creating a democracy, but it was very significant for ending the rule of absolute monarchs, and it planted the seeds for a parliamentary government. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. The relationship between King Charles I and Parliament had become increasingly strained. In January 1642, King Charles entered the House of Commons with an armed unit of soldiers. He intended to arrest 5 members of Parliament. The MPs had been forewarned and were not there. The parliamentarians then argued that Charles was abusing his power. This led to a civil war between the royalists and the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians won with Oliver Cromwell as their leader. England became a republic for a brief period in history. However, Oliver Cromwell became a de facto dictator, and another conflict occurred to restore a monarchy with Charles II. The American Constitution. in 1787, which took place at the aftermath of the American Revolution. The founding fathers of America wished to create a new democratic society based on democratic principles of one man, one vote. Eventually, this statement was adjusted to incorporate women and freedom from slavery. The first 10 amendments, known collectively as the Bill of Rights, offer specific protection of individual liberty and justice and place restrictions on the powers of government. This was a significant advancement for democracy. The French Revolution, 1787 to 1799, overthrew the absolute monarch of France. The ideals of the French Revolution hoped to restore power and wealth to the whole of society and end the great inequality of the previous government. In the short term, the French Revolution didn't create a democracy, but it changed attitudes throughout the world. The threat of revolution was a factor in encouraging European states to devolve power and contemplate greater democracy. The scene you see here is the National Assembly meeting after the revolution. This is where the term the political left and right come from. At the beginning of the assembly, all those who wanted change were asked to stand on the left, and they were for liberty or liberal. All those who wanted to conserve the system and replace the monarch with a new monarch were asked to stand on the right, as they would become conservative. If you'd like to know more about the political spectrum and how it works, then please view the Political Spectrum podcast. The Great Reform Act in 1832 to 1837. Parliament passed a law changing the British electoral system. This was a response to many years of people criticising the electoral system as unfair. For example, there were constituencies with only a handful of voters that elected 2 MPs to Parliament. In these so-called rotten boroughs, with few voters and no secret ballot, it was easy for candidates to buy votes. Yet towns like Manchester, that had grown during the previous 80 years, had no MPs to represent them. The suffragettes were members of women's organisations in the late 19th and early 20th century, which advocated the extension of the right to vote, which is universal suffrage, to public elections to women. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to give women the vote. This significant milestone was a couple of decades before many other Western democracies like the UK and the US did the same. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the end of one-party rule in Eastern Europe. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had initiated reforms which led to greater openness and democracy in the Soviet Union. Unlike his Soviet predecessors, he allowed Eastern countries to follow their independent democratic fate. The event has been viewed as democracy's triumph over communism. The End of History and the Last Man is a book written by Francis Fukuyama in 1992. The book expands on his essay in 1989, The End of History, in which Fukuyama argues that the advent of Western liberal democracy is signalling the end point of humanity's socio-cultural evolution, and the final form of human government has arrived, which is liberal democracy. Fukuyama contradicts that of Karl Marx, who predicted that communism would replace capitalism. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, Fukuyama states that communism can no longer stand in the way of the world becoming a liberal democracy. If we want to look at how democratic the world is today, then we can look at the Democracy Index and the Failed State Index. The Democracy Index is an index compiled by the Economic Intelligence Unit that measures the state of democracy in 167 states. The index is based on 60 indicators which are grouped into 5 different categories. As you can see from the map, the areas in green are considered to be functioning democracies. The areas in lighter green edging towards yellow are still democracies, however with certain flaws. Once we get to the darker colours of orange and red, then these countries are either failing to become democracies or opposing them. You can see that democracy fits quite well with the First World Order, and that the Western democratic states are all coloured either green, light green or yellow, whereas the socialist communist world that reject democracy or just not good at doing it are highlighted in the darker colours. When the scores for these states are being conducted, they take into consideration whether the national elections of the state are free and fair, the security of the voters, the influence of foreign powers on the government, and also the capability of the civil servants and the government to implement its policies. The failed state index indicates the vulnerabilities for a state to conflict or collapse. A failed state is a state perceived as having failed at some of the basic conditions and responsibilities of a sovereign government. If you wanted to summarise this, you could say that a failed state is somewhere that's not a very nice place to live, and a stable state could be considered somewhere that's a nice place to live. So if you look at the map, you can see that all the areas in green, considered to be stable states, are relatively nice places to live, whereas the ones that are not green and dark red and orange, the quality of life there isn't going to be as good. Now if we compare this with the democracy index, you can see a clear parallel with where there are functioning democracies, they tend to be nicer places to live. So although realists and Socrates made a relevant argument for some of the failings of democracy, I would argue that democracy is the best form of government that is available to us.
If you've enjoyed this workshop, then please visit Education and Training for more options. And thank you for visiting.